we already had some very fascinating speakers in this session today. My presentation will be a little bit different than the ones that you have already seen, in the sense it's the presentation of an academic empirical paper. But bear with me, because the conclusion will be something that you guys, this audience, likes, namely that the government is bad, government debt is bad. So bear with me through the presentation, and you will get the results. So it is an academical paper, empirical paper, because it was a draft version of this paper was a part of my doctoral dissertation, which I defended a couple of years back. I will very, very briefly guide you to the structure of this dissertation, simply to set the scene, so to speak. So we started with what some of you guys might know, the infamous Reinert and Rogoff paper, which says that there is a 90% debt threshold after which economic growth plummets. If debt reaches 90%, all hell breaks loose, and then economic growth falters. Surprisingly, that's not the case. There is not one debt threshold for every country, for every year, after which, if you reach it, then economic growth falters. But that, of course, does not mean that public debt is not bad. It can have negative implications for economy, and that's what we study in subsequent work, the impact on public investment, on private investment. My paper the paper that I will present today will be on the negative impact of public debt on public investment. The paper on the negative impact of public debt on private investment was just published about 6 months ago in Open Economies Review. And I hope I can capture some feedback from you guys today on my paper, so we can get that paper published as well. So that's the setup. I'll also, because I think that not everybody is very interested in the very econometric stuff, so I'll keep that part very brief. I'll try to keep my presentation also under the 15 minutes, so that I won't get too many signs that I have to stop, and we have some time for Q&A also. So that's the focus of my talk today. What is a research question? So we saw after the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis that we saw that there was a marked increase in public debt, and at the same time public investment plummeted. But rather surprisingly, there was very little research on did the increase in debt cause the decrease in public investment. Also, in general, there was very little research on the decline of the public investment in general. Was it due to cyclical factors? We know by now that financial recessions are generally followed by a slower recovery, or more structural factors. We have a more aging society which simply has limited needs for public investment. There's very little research on that, and our paper aims to fill that gap, or at least partly. So, in this graph, you see the evolution of public debt and public investment between 1995 and 2015. As you see, let's see if this works. As you see here, around the sovereign debt crisis, you see that public investment plummets and public debt rises. Just some numbers. After the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis, you saw that public debt increased by 66% in the EU, by 70% in the Eurozone, and by more than 86% in the PIGS. And at the same time, public investment decreased by 6% in the EU, by 11% in the Eurozone, and by a whopping 37% in the PIGS. So, just by looking at this graph, you would think there is indeed a link between both. So, very briefly, why do we need public investment? Why is it important? Of course, it's important for productivity growth, especially investments in R&D are important in that effect. Also, because of spillover effects to the private sector. To give a brief example, if you have a highly educated workforce, that's very interesting for the private sector, because they want to invest to tap that pool of highly educated people. It can also crowd in private investment. For example, if we build sufficient roads to get produce to markets. Also, investment in defense, of course, and in general, public investment has been very cyclical. It has been cut if governments need to cut their budgets, but it can also be used as a counter-cyclical response to a crisis. So, what are the drivers of the decline in public investment? Generally, we can say there are three different hypotheses. We can say there are cyclical factors, simply because of austerity, governments need to cut their budgets, and cutting public investment is very easy to do because there is no constituency behind public investment, as is the case, for example, if you want to cut pensions, if you want to cut the salaries of public workers. As I said, could also be two cyclical factors: an aging society which has less need for example, infrastructure, or it could be due to a debt overhang effect, and that's what we study in our paper. Oh, something went wrong there. So this is an overview of the literature. I'm going to completely skip that here. It's also not very relevant for my discussion. For those who are interested, they can, of course, look it up in our paper. But what is important is that, in our view, the current literature suffers from three major limitations. First, the focus of this debt overhang effect is generally on developing economies. And if there are any papers on the more advanced economies, there are hardly any papers on the entire EU. Secondly, there is the issue of endogeneity. Sounds complex, but it simply means that it could be the case that it's not high debt that leads to low investment. It could be the other way around. And we're going to say, I'm going to say in the next slide how we tackle that. And finally, there is very little research on the determinants of public investment. Again, rather surprisingly, one would think that by now there is a large body of research studying what drives public investment. Not the case. So we add to the literature by looking at the entire EU. We use a novel approach, an instrumental variable approach, to tackle the issue of endogeneity, and we use a rich set of explanatory variables to study the impact of public debt on public investment. So, as I said here, we study whether the EU suffers from a debt overhang effect for 26 EU countries over the period 1995 until 2015, and we use several econometric techniques to do it. We also have a number of extensions. We look whether the debt overhang effect differs for high debt versus low debt countries in the EU versus the Eurozone, and also if it's only a matter of stock of debt or whether also the flow of debt, the increase or decrease of debt matters. Okay, this is our estimation that we use. As I said, I will not focus that much on this. Only on our next slide, I say which control variables which we use. It simply says that public investment is a function of a number of control variables, public debt, and also we have some fixed effects in here. The problem with this equation, and I'm going to focus on that because that is important, is that there's quite some persistence in public investment. Indeed, one can expect that public investment today is by a large extent determined by public investment in T-1. And also there could be reverse causality, as I already mentioned. And the easiest way to grasp that is, like I said, the correlation between high debt and low growth. It could indeed be the case that it's not high debt that leads to low growth, but it could be the case that if growth is low, if we are in a recession, that in that case public debt then falls, or public investment falls rather. So there's this reverse causality between the two, and basically very simple econometric techniques like an OLS or a fixed effects equation, they can't tackle that. And what we do is we add, for the first issue, we add like public investment, and we also use a instrumental variable approach, which is based, it's a GMM model, which is based on the linear estimator of Arlano and Bond. Simply what you need to know is that legs of the potentially endogenous variables are used as instruments in this econometric techniques. It basically allows you to study whether we cannot talk about correlation, but really the causality, whether it's really the case that it's public debt that causes low investment. So these are all the variables which we use in our model. We include public investment, of course. We also use the 10-year government bond yield for the borrowing rate, public debt. We also look at public expenditure. We include trade openness, private investment, income, business cycle, and also production expectations to see whether indeed it is cyclical. There is a lot of talk in our paper about the rationale for including those control variables, but again, for this session, I don't think that's very relevant. What is relevant is our results. So here I show the results for a baseline regression. I immediately go to our GMM model because it is the most sound model that we use. And what do we find? We find that indeed public investment is in T-1 is very significant, which basically validates our econometric technique. Indeed, we need to include like public investment to say something useful about the link between public debt and public investment. So that's good. And secondly, what do we find for our main research question? We indeed find that there is a negative effect of public debt on public investment. If public debt increases...
That's the level.
That's the level, indeed. We'll go to the delta in a couple of slides, but this is indeed the level. What this means is that if you look over the entire EU, on average, if public debt increases by 1 percentage point, then public investment decreases by 0.03 percentage point. And to put this figure into perspective, because those kind of numbers, it's always a bit hard to really think about what does this mean in hard euros. It would mean that given the levels of public investment which were prevalent in 2015, if public debt would decrease by 10 percentage points, okay, thank you, we see an increase of public investment about 18.5 billion euros. So that is quite a significant amount. We also study whether we also do a robustness check, because it indeed could be the case that there was like a common shock which has resulted public debt to increase and public investment to decrease. So that there is a third explanation. That is indeed the case. There is a common shock. We use VIX. Not relevant here, but this is something which is usually done in the literature, and we again find the same result. So a robustness check is valid. We indeed find that public debt remains a negative, remains a drag on public investment. We also study whether there is a difference in high debt versus low debt countries, and we group these countries according to their average debt over the entire period, the 1995 to 2015 period. And what do we find? Indeed, that this negative effect of debt on investment is only prevalent in these high debt countries. That's something which is indeed quite interesting to note. Okay, I'll skip that one. We also focus on the Eurozone. What is the rationale here? Yes?
Let's go back to that prior one. That argues for a threshold effect, and that kind of supports the Rogoff-Reinhardt.
That indeed it does, and we studied quite a lot. We studied for different thresholds, but we didn't find one numerical value. But this indeed argues for a threshold effect, but we didn't find a very numerical threshold. But we're still looking whether we can use some econometric techniques to find that threshold, maybe a quadratic function or something. But we're looking into that to find whether there indeed is maybe.
Well, then we're looking at some other consequence. You're looking at public investment.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, then on the Eurozone, what is the rationale here? You oftentimes hear that the institutional arrangements of the Eurozone act like a straitjacket on countries of the Eurozone. We have the debt target of 60%, you have the 3% deficit rule, and so if debt increases, it could be the case that governments need to cut their debt very rapidly, and then public investment is an easy target. We indeed find that there is a negative effect of public debt on public investment in the Eurozone, but the effect is smaller than in the entire Eurozone. So it's not that, that the institutional arrangements of the Eurozone are more stringent than the institutional arrangements regarding public debt in the entire EU. Okay, then whether it's mainly a matter of stocks or flows, what do we find here? We find indeed that delta public debt, so the increase in public debt, has a significantly negative effect on public investment. Okay, and then I will just go to. I will skip the summary of my findings, but I will go to the conclusion where we explain the mechanism that we think is playing up here. We say that if sovereign debt rises, public investment is crowded out by the increase in debt servicing costs. And because governments are biased towards reducing investment spending rather than curtailing current spending. And that's, as I mentioned in the introduction, it's simply politically easier to defer investment spending than it is to cut the wages of, for example, government workers. And it's especially the case in a lot of countries in the EU, which have like a government take of 54%. And as a result, highly indebted governments spend less on public investment. So from an economic policy perspective, that would advocate for fiscal consolidation. So, right in time. Are there any questions, remarks regarding my presentation?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just maybe one question. To what extent would interest rates interfere in this kind of equation?
Yeah, we control for the borrowing rate. So one would indeed expect that it's the cost of government debt which is more significant, but we do not find that in our results. We do not find that the interest rate, the cost of borrowing for governments, that is more of a drag than it is than simply the public debt levels.
Any more short question? So.
Indeed, the negative effect on private investment, then I defer to my other paper, which is a fascinating paper also to read.
To what extent would that analysis corroborate or confirm a public-private partnership investment? Did you look at that?
No, that's something on the side, and I can't answer that in 15 seconds. But it's a very interesting remark. Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, I found the question interesting if investments are, let's say, easier to cut than, let's say, social spending. I mean, a very simple way to, let's say, investigate this would just use social spending instead of investment and see if you get different figures, different results.
And what would be
in the sense that maybe higher debt would also reduce social spending, or maybe you get even the opposite sign of the, just to get an idea how it is related somehow.
Okay, that's a very good idea indeed. Thank you very much.
So, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, very interesting.